Ave Maria in the Afternoon is a co-production of Ave Maria Radio and EWTN Radio and carried across the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. Welcome to Ave Maria in the Afternoon, examining the world through the lens of faith from the heart of the Church to help us navigate the culture. Here's Dr. Marcus Peter.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on this hour of Ave Maria in the Afternoon. I'm Marcus Peter. The first few weeks of the Trump presidency has featured for us several major executive orders. All of these have directly impacted the family and religious liberty in one way or another. A recent executive order has directed the U.S. Domestic Policy Council to examine ways to lower costs for in vitro fertilization. So there's a tremendous amount that we need to talk about pertaining to these steps moving forward and how the battle for the Christian ethos for marriage and the family is not over. We review a lot of these executive orders with Andrea Picciotti-Bear and to gain a perspective of where we stand and where the fight needs to keep going. We go on from there to speak with Dr. Richard Decloux. The life of Jesus is actually the central point in human history. And I'm not exaggerating here. If we're being honest, if we're being sincerely honest, study any major historical figure and you will see that even if you don't acknowledge his divinity, Jesus Christ of Nazareth is without a doubt the most influential figure in human history. And I'm not just talking about the sheer preponderance of textual evidence for the proof of the impact of his life, and therefore his conception, his birth, his incarnation, I should say, and his birth, his infancy narratives, his years as a child, especially that story of him being 12 in the temple and his public ministry, and then his passion, death, resurrection, and ascension. The historical evidence for all of these things, the sheer preponderance of it is undeniable. But even beyond that, the moral impact he's had and the directional impact he's had epistemologically in the shaping of the direction of all the world, especially the Western Hemisphere, by the time the faith goes to Rome and then the impact it has on the rest of the world, is without a doubt the most impactful figure that you could possibly find. And so we're going to talk with Dr. Richard Decloux about that. And finally, we discuss with Professor David Hart Jimmy Carter's lessons on politics, what we can learn from him. Because when he died, many political commentators pointed to his career as the antithesis of the religious right. They said he represented a faith-based politics that could turn the U.S. Christian. But there's more to talk about this. And we talk about all of this after the headlines.
Thanks, Marcus. Good afternoon, everyone. This is your Ave Maria Radio News for Wednesday, February 19th. It's the Feast of Conrad of Piacenza. Today's news is brought to you by the Ave Maria Family of Funds at AveMariaFunds.com. The Vatican says Pope Francis showed a slight improvement today as he continues his stay in the hospital. The Holy Father is suffering through double pneumonia. He was visited today by Italian President Meloni, who said he was alert and responsive. Stay tuned to EWTN News and Ave Maria Radio for more updates. President Trump is meeting with two key European leaders next week.
French President Emmanuel Macron and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer will visit Washington next week to meet with Trump. This as European leaders raise flags about Trump's handling of Russia's war in Ukraine. The president has gone after Ukrainian President Zelensky, blaming him for starting the conflict with Russia. I'm Lisa Taylor.
An American school teacher is back home in Pennsylvania after spending over 3 years in a Russian prison. His family says Mark Fogel arrived in Pittsburgh yesterday. Fogel was detained at a Moscow airport in 2021 after being stopped with a small amount of medical marijuana and was recently released in exchange for a Russian cybercriminal. Fogel's family spoke last week with EWTN about their strong faith and devotion to the Rosary. The interview can be found at the National Catholic Register. The East Coast is getting hit with another winter storm. Mid-Atlantic states such as Virginia, North Carolina, Maryland, and Delaware could see anywhere from 6 to 12 inches of snow. Freezing temperatures are being felt from as far north as Wyoming and Montana to far south as Texas and Alabama. Meta plans to build the longest undersea internet cable in the world. The Facebook and Instagram parent company expects the multi-billion-dollar project to be completed by the end of the decade. The more than 31,000-mile cable will connect the U.S. with India, Brazil, South Africa, and other regions. From your AveMariaRadio.net news desk, I'm Steve Clark.
Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. The first few weeks of the Trump presidency have featured for all of us a slew of major executive orders. All of them have directly impacted either the family or religious liberty in the nation. We're going to review a lot of them with Andrea Pichotti-Bear. Andrea is legal analyst for EWTN News and director of the Conscience Project. You can follow her work at conscience-project.org. Andrea, I'm very glad you're joining us. How are you?
I'm doing great, Marcus. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. And hopeful, despite the fact that the most recent executive order has broadened the fight for those of us in the Catholic front and in the pro-life front. But let's talk about this from a big picture perspective. There were a lot of freedoms when it came to religious liberty that were attacked or at the very least placed pressure on by the Biden administration. We are seeing that pressure lessen, and we're actually seeing movements in the right direction for freedom of religion, speech, and basic rights of family under the Trump administration.
Yeah, Marcus, and I would say, particularly with what it means to be human, the nature of human beings made in the image and likeness of God, male and female. That's one particularly important step that I think that President Trump did take in his administration is basically walking back some of the really harmful things that were done in the prior administration under the guise of gender ideology and manipulating the idea of fairness. Yep. Especially fairness in our laws related to sex discrimination and prohibitions on sex discrimination. So, that's really, really on the plus side. I can't agree with you more, though, that there are very big problems that we have with regard to executive orders related to IVF and some of the other actions that are being undertaken that really go to the heart of the church's response and the response of believers to the suffering and the vulnerable.
I talked about this at length in the first hour of today's program, but in the interest of listeners who just joined us on this national hour, I want to ask you to just make sure that everyone listening has an understanding of what the Trump administration has done in terms of this executive order and IVF.
I think that there's, I don't want to speak for the president because I actually disagree with this announcement, and I think it's really harmful and confusing. And I think anyone that is of childbearing age knows that there's been just so much confusion, Marcus, over procreation and fertility and infertility. We know that it is a great struggle that families that are infertile go through, especially those that have lost children that have been conceived and they weren't able to be born or carry the pregnancy to term. I do think that it's a misplaced sense of, concern for people. This idea that we'll fix things even if the way that we fix them is not right, that desire to fix it is good enough to justify things. And it's just very important that everyone be very aware that the scientific methods that are being used in IVF do generate a number, countless of fertilized eggs, babies, embryos that are discarded or even, terribly frozen. That life would be frozen for maybe I'll want, to tap into that bank later in life. That's not respectful of God's creation. Yes. And I'm hoping that there can be in the implementation of these just more nuance that's consistent with not only what we know as Catholics to be true, but what people just from the natural law can understand of the created human beings, and that this isn't something to be manipulated in a lab. Yeah,
that's effectively where my analysis landed as well. I think there's some level of good intent here, but the execution warrants tremendous investigation. Now, going back to the conversation we were having earlier about steps in the right direction, you and I have lamented just how anywhere from ironic to baffling it was that the Biden administration accepted and embraced gender ideology as a form of gospel truth, and it was completely determined to move down that path. So moving down the path of sanity, the duality of the sexes, the recognition of maleness and femaleness, and having that be the new language for our nation, and hopefully cemented in language in the public sphere, is a hope we all have.
You know, and Marcus, you're really right in pointing out how helpful language can be to reinforce basic reality and truths, and how confusing it can be. I mean, we saw it in the context of life when people would talk about being pro-abortion as being pro-choice, right? That was a very confusing manipulation of language. And the idea of gender identity just doesn't have any basis in biological reality. Yeah. I think it's really a great return to what people just kind of can see. At the same time, there is an issue of people that are struggling with dysphoria. A lot of people are struggling, young people are struggling, and getting at the root causes of that kind of confusion is something that families are going to have to deal with, communities, churches, to be able to walk with people out of that kind of dark confusion into the light, into embracing their own created reality. Right. I love in particular that in one of the executive orders that President Trump signed early on in the administration, he really directed the Department of Health and Human Services to do more research on what supports we can give to people who are struggling, especially young people. And I think that's, we've got some of the best and brightest scientists in the world that are in this country, and to be able to do the research, to be able to find out helpful, lasting solutions to this grave dysphoria that people are struggling with, to address the mental health aspects in ways that will not cause physical harm and or more confusion, but instead lead people to support that they need.
Yep, and all of that is exactly the hope and the direction we should be moving toward. Alternative therapies and resources and avenues that families can explore together, and that parents can help children accept the biological reality that they have, because it is not separate from the interior psychological reality that they have. And now coupled with that is this whole notion of the weaponization of ideology in education. So thankfully, gender ideology is not going to have a place in education, but also other forms of indoctrination, anywhere from anti-American, anti-Western civilization to racial radical indoctrination in K through 12 schools. So there's a lot of hope here in terms of school choice and for parents educating their children.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think any parent out there today knows that, we really want our kids to be prepared in life. We do want them to learn how to be contributors to their communities, to be reliable citizens, to have a sense of civic duty and pride, civic pride, be patriotic. But none of that was being served by a lot of these kind of progressive ideologies that have been injected, especially into the public school system, but not exclusively. A lot of private schools have taken that baton and run with it as well. And sadly, some of our religious schools. And this is a really great wake-up call to recenter education on what it should be, which is kind of focus on the fundamentals of intellectual development and not these kind of partisan trends of the day. Yep. That can be very confusing for young learners, and often we've seen it to be at odds with what their parents are teaching at home or their faith tradition, their family's faith tradition is. So it was not only pushing an ideology that was problematic, but causing any kind of tension in the family unit is nothing that a school should be doing. Exactly,
and nothing that the federal government should be endorsing for that matter. So,
absolutely.
Subsidiarity, steps in the right direction for the sake of the flourishing of the family. Andrea, thank you very much for making time to speak with us.
It was my pleasure, Marcus. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. My guest, Andrea Pachotti-Bear, legal analyst for EWTN News, director of the Conscience Project. We've been talking about religious liberty issues in the United States, particularly with regards to the executive orders that have been put into place by President Donald Trump and his administration. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.
When your children consider going to college, where are you going to find a place that will prepare them for the future and build on the foundation that you've laid? The answer? Ave Maria University. With an authentically Catholic curriculum, including 35 majors, AMU prepares students to take on the world.
My daughter told me she was published in a scientific journal as an undergrad. I'm so proud of her. The world needs Catholic physicists, and my daughter's going to be one of them.
Learn more at avemaria.edu. That's avemaria.edu.
Ave Maria in the Afternoon is underwritten by the following nonprofit organization: Real Estate for Life. Buying or selling your home or business property? Real Estate for Life can connect you with one of 1,400 pro-life real estate agents around the world. When Real Estate for Life receives a referral fee, they donate 70% to Ave Maria Radio and Human Life International. More information at realestateforlife.org or 877-LIFE-US1. That's realestateforlife.org.
Ever thought you'd make a bundle by trading in or selling your used vehicle only to find out it's worth a dinner for two? Well, it's much more valuable to donate your vehicle to Ave Maria Radio. Thousands of Americans donate their vehicle each year. The donation to Ave Maria is easy, tax-deductible, and supports our efforts to evangelize. A year from now, will you remember that dinner or your gracious and selfless donation? Go to AveMariaRadio.net to find out more. That's AveMariaRadio.net.
We are the pro-life generation, passionate about building the culture of life in our healthcare and in our nation. But not all healthcare options are equally pro-life, and some provide morally objectionable procedures. CMF Curo is different. CMF Curo is a pro-life Catholic healthcare ministry providing a pathway for its members to build the culture of life in their healthcare choices, not destroy it. Learn more about CMF Curo at mycatholichealthcare.com. That's mycatholichealthcare.com.
Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. It doesn't take Christian faith to acknowledge that, from an historical perspective, the life of Jesus, from his birth onwards at the very least, stands as the center point of human history, natural history. And to the extent that we use his birth as the dividing point in our calendar, to tracing the heritage of human flourishing and civilization to his work and the foundation of Christian faith that can be traced completely to him. And it goes even deeper than that. Joining me to have this conversation is Dr. Richard Decloux. Dr. Decloux is the professor of theology at the Word on Fire Institute, and he is the author of Jesus as the Center of History, published on wordonfire.org. Richard, thank you very much for joining us. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
No, well, I appreciate having you on, and you and I share a similar drive for trying to make sure that this particular truth, that the Christian influence when it comes to the entire flow of Western civilization and human flourishing has been undeniable, and in particular here, the role of Jesus Christ at the center of that pivoting point in human history. So let's paint with broad strokes here. Let's talk big picture for a while.
Okay, yeah. So very basically, there's this sort of Neoplatonic idea that gets picked up by some of the church fathers like Augustine and then extended through the medievals like St. Bonaventure and St. Thomas Aquinas, that there's this exitus reditus movement of creation coming forth from the Creator and then returning back to the Creator. So God being sort of the Alpha and the Omega, right? The origin of the world, but also the goal of the world. And we can understand then the incarnation, so the coming of Christ, the Word made flesh, as sort of the turning point of this movement. He's the one through whom the exitus becomes the reditus. So he's the pathway back to God. And therefore he is the center of history because he marks his very, the incarnation itself sort of marks this transition from the proceeding forth to the returning back.
Right. And one of the ways in which we can learn to start seeing this is by understanding that salvation history truly is the only objective way to view human history. But when we have that worldview, the reading of human history makes sense in light of God's providential plan. And you truly do see how Jesus' birth, like you mentioned, becomes this pivoting point of that reditus. Christ is the one that draws all men to himself, and therefore it is through him that man gets to return to the Father.
Exactly. And this is especially the case considering the fall, because the union with God had been broken through man's sin, and therefore we needed to have this reunification between the divine and the human, which is found most perfectly through the hypostatic union of the two natures in the one person of Christ.
Yeah. And that even that doctrine of the hypostatic union suddenly gives man and his meaning, his very nature, a new direction, a decisive horizon, because now all of a sudden the same human nature that you and I possess has been assumed by the divine nature, and therefore there is a true metaphysical and dare I say beatific reality. There's a heavenly reality that we can truly look forward to, that our human nature has been elevated to the heights of heaven in Christ's ascension.
Right, by the divine person taking on our human nature, we have been granted a share in divine life itself, which of course, relates to the whole notion of the headship of Christ, or capital grace, where the merits of our Lord's passion, death, and resurrection are sort of distributed from our head, Christ the head, to the rest of his body.
Right, and the founding of his church, just from a purely historical standpoint alone, created this explosive moment in history, because now there is this mission that's going to inaugurate the entirety of the created order into Christ. So whether or not someone accepts faith in Jesus Christ, the effects of this church can be felt as ripples throughout human history. The flourishing we find in human civilization, even something as simple as the Benedictines creating beer and the process of creating beer, to commerce, to the flourishing of villages around monasteries that eventually created these hubs of civilization and the sciences. All of these can be traced to how the Catholic Church effectively built the West.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the Catholic Church is really the origin of the university system that we know today, and that forms a major part of Western culture, and increasingly the culture of other areas of the globe as well.
So when we think about, for example, these doctrinal things that we had to pass throughout human history, throughout Christian history, questions, for example, against the Arian heresy, the Council of Nicaea, one would think, okay, that sounds like lofty doctrine, but there's a key reality at play here, and that is that it pertains directly to the soteriology, the salvation of all mankind, whether or not Christ was, is, and will forever be fully divine.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and it also, I think, this speaks the importance of metaphysics, which unfortunately has been lost by a lot of people in our contemporary world. But that we are talking about the reality of existence and being itself.
Right.
It's not just hypothetical mythology. It actually has to do with the reality of the world and the very being of what it means to be human.
Right.
What the goal, the telos, the teleology of human nature is, and that which makes it possible to attain that telos, which is only the divine grace that comes through Christ.
Yeah. And that telos, that final end that we're all made for, if we keep that in view, which is ultimately heaven in Christ, so having the sacramental heavenly worldview, this perspective, if we keep that in mind, that's essentially the only thing that's going to give us lasting meaning to all of our efforts here on this earth. And so all of a sudden, the smallest to the greatest events in our life are not in vain, because Christ our Lord is the master over even history.
Right, yeah. And, I think it's in this day and age when people want to try to invent their own version of what it means to be human, it's really a rejection of our creatureliness. I mean, it ends up becoming an imitation of the diabolical refusal to submit to the truth that God himself has created.
Right.
And, it's something we can kick and scream against, but there's no way around it. Human nature is what it is, and it has a goal that has been given to it by its creator, and therefore there's really no escaping it. The only real pathway to salvation is through the acceptance of the nature and the supernatural goal that we've been given. And that's actually good news, because human nature and our, final end of the beatific vision are much greater than what we would have invented for ourselves.
Yeah. And like you said, that's good news. That's news of infinite hope, because that infinite hope is found in the infinite God, who has given us finite beings a means to participate in his own divine life. So for all of our listeners listening right now, there's a practical reality at play here. Number one, that our human lives are not futile. Number two, that there's an eternal worldview, hope, there's an eternal perspective that we ought to claim. So just leave us with that exhortation.
Yes, exactly. And there's also another important point, which is that our common humanity really does bind us together, from no matter what our countries of origin are or whatever. Like, all humans do share in the same nature that was assumed by Christ, and therefore we are linked together in our origin and in our end. And therefore the vertical communion with God is the foundation for our unity as humanity.
Well, Richard, thank you very, very much for making the time to speak with us.
My pleasure. Happy to do it.
My guest, Dr. Richard DeClue, Professor of Theology at the Word on Fire Institute. We've been talking about how Jesus Christ, as a figure, as a man, as an historical figure, was the turning point of the entirety of human history. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.
When your children consider going to college, where are you going to find a place that will prepare them for the future and build on the foundation that you've laid? The answer? Ave Maria University. With an authentically Catholic curriculum, including 35 majors, AMU prepares students to take on the world.
I've seen the difference in my son since he's been at Ave Maria. He's happy, he's excited about what he's going to do with his degree, and he's living his faith.
Learn more at avemaria.edu. That's avemaria.edu.
If you're still on the fence about purchasing a new air conditioner, just know that prices are expected to increase by 25% over the next year due to EPA standards. Don't wait.
Hi, I'm Ron Garmo with Running Right Heating and Cooling. Call us today for a free quote on a new air conditioning system and all your heating and cooling needs. Mention Ave Maria Radio and get a 10% discount.
Call today, 248-884-1704, or go to runningrightHVAC.com to schedule an appointment.
Underwritten in part by the following nonprofit.
Are you paying high prices with a traditional health insurance company that pays for things that violate your conscience? There's an alternative available. Solidarity HealthShare is a community of faithful individuals and families that never share into immoral medical services, all while saving you money with prices starting as low as $85 per month for singles and $512 for families. Never fund another abortion with your healthcare dollars. Call 844-313-4999 to learn more.
Italy aficionado Teresa Tomio's newest book is now out on the Ave Maria online store. In Italy's Shrines and Wonders, Teresa Tomio provides how best to navigate the most popular sites, best routes, and how to best to soak in all the beauty Italy has to offer. She also shares the most inspiring journeys to make your Italy excursion utterly unforgettable. Italy's Shrines and Wonders from Catholic Connections Teresa Tomio can be purchased at AveMariaRadio.net.
A man who had been on a deserted island for 40 years was finally rescued. 2 weeks after he was rescued, he made his first trip to the grocery store. All he wanted was a bottle of water. But as he stood in the middle of the aisle, looking at hydration waters, energy waters, prebiotic and probiotic waters, the man stood paralyzed. He did not know what they were, or which among them all was the best. And so he remained for an hour, staring about him, paralyzed by choice. Having choice without first understanding what is good leads not to freedom. When there is no concept of a perfect good, an ideal, choice can only lead to enslavement. Freedom of choice was the other tree in the garden. The tree of life is first. GuadalupeWorkers.org.
This program brought to you in part by Ave Maria, Florida, a big kind of small town where golf carts take you everywhere and there's always something fun around the corner. Discover championship golf, resort-style amenities, and a town center full of shopping and dining. With Ave Maria University and Ave Maria Catholic Church at its heart, it's a community full of connection and charm. More than 25 model homes are available for viewing. More information can be found at AveMaria.com. That's AveMaria.com.
Support for this Ave Maria radio program comes in part by the non-for-profit St. Anthony Services. Are you shopping for mortgage products, Catholic investing, Catholic health, real estate, or estate planning? StAnthonyServices.org can help you find a Catholic professional for these needs. They regularly connect faithful citizens with faith-based professionals that share our Christian values. More information at StAnthonyServices.org or 877-LIFE-US1.
Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. When President Jimmy Carter died, many political commentators pointed to his career as a kind of antithesis to the religious right. They said he represented a faith-based politics that could turn the United States Christian, but one of the most important lessons of his presidency is that Christians often do more good outside of politics than in office. And that's part of the consideration, truly, in our lives as being Christian. Joining me to have this conversation is Professor Darryl Hart. He teaches history at Hillsdale College and is author of the most recently published book, American Catholic, The Politics of Faith During the Cold War. Darryl, thank you very much for joining us. How are you?
All right. Thank you. Good to be with you.
It's good to have you on. I always enjoy when I get to connect with you folks at Hillsdale. And so you, Brad, Nathan, always a joy. And I'm never disappointed in this case, for example, talking about Jimmy Carter's faith and how it appealed to progressive evangelicals. Many evangelicals were actually ecstatic when him as a presidential candidate claimed to have been born again. He openly spoke about his relationship with Jesus. But there was some level of disappointment about how he lived out his faith in office. So let's make sure we frame this question rightly before we continue. Darryl, just give us an overview of how to perceive the way in which Jimmy Carter lived his faith in office.
Sure. Well, I mean, he gained notoriety because he was I guess the first president actually to describe himself in the run-up to the election as a born-again Christian. And the word born-again, back then, people didn't know, at least the press corps didn't. I've talked to some people in the press who were covering politics back then, and people were scurrying to either their dictionaries or calling people to try to figure out what that was. Mm-hmm. Of course, evangelical Protestants had been around for a while, and that phrasing was typical to them, but Carter identified himself as such, and he gained, I think, the support of Republicans and Democrats who were Christians, especially Protestants, because of that, not merely because he used that particular phrase, but that was a time when a lot of Christians were worried about the secularization of American society, the relativism of morality more generally, and so Carter seemed to be a person of faith who might be able to do some good things in office. He had a tougher go of it as a president as anyone would have had at that time. That was a difficult period in American history, politically, economically, because of inflation, the energy crisis, the hostage crisis eventually that happened on his watch with Iran. So he faced a number of difficulties, but he also, during his presidency, lost support from evangelicals, in particular his own group, as it were, because he was not as strong on certain moral convictions like abortion, like gay marriage, or at least homosexuality. And that created an opening for a group that became known as the moral majority, and those people wound up supporting Ronald Reagan.
Right.
Many of them, or most of them, supported Reagan about 4 years later.
Right. And in fact, one of the more vocal individuals at the forefront of the movement trying to orchestrate his defeat here, Carter's defeat, was Pat Robertson, who at one point was an avid supporter of Carter and at least the evangelicalism that Carter touted to have held, until it was very clear that his brand of evangelicalism leaned closer towards a kind of progressivist expression rather than the mainstream Southern Baptist conservative expression at the time.
Well, I mean, you bring up a thorny question there a little bit when you mention the Southern Baptist Convention, because that was Carter's background.
Yeah.
And the Southern Baptists were actually going through a bit of a controversy themselves and emerging from a more mainline orientation, which they had been, say, between the 1920s and 1970s. And at the end of the 1970s, there was a conservative, I don't like to use the word takeover because it sounds hostile and whatnot, but the way Baptist politics can work, it isn't always pretty either. But the SBC, and I haven't read much about the degree to which Carter's presidency and his notoriety was a factor in this. But by 1980, the Southern Baptist Convention was controlled, at least in its various offices and institutions, by conservatives, which was a remarkable change in the denomination. So Carter probably did reflect a more mainline orientation of the Southern Baptists. And as some historians have written recently, even before his death, that he identified with a kind of progressive, a sane progressivism in the Democratic Party, but his outlet for a faith-based politics was much more in the civil rights movement associated with Martin Luther King Jr. than it was, say, in what was coming with the moral majority.
Right, exactly. And that's unfortunately what put him in this position, because it was easy for the like you mentioned, the takeover, for want of a better term. It was easy for people of that cohort within the SBC to chalk Carter's positions and stances up as to nothing more than secular humanism. And he was actually concerned for a lot of social justice issues at the time. What they were hoping for was a more outwardly, avidly, explicitly evangelical expression of the president within the presidential office, and that they didn't get from him.
Right. People were hoping he would be pretty firm on, the basic moral convictions surrounding marriage and reproduction and families. And it's not as if he was awful in those things. He was obviously a man of great personal integrity and firm moral convictions himself, but he didn't necessarily want that to be part of his administration. And this is the other side of the Baptist factor here, with a long tradition in the Baptist world, whether southern, northern, whatever, of separation of church and state. To think about using government for religious purposes would not come naturally to Baptists, even though there was a point in American society where I think people, Protestant and Roman Catholic, were very much concerned about the direction of America and were hoping for some kind of moral input,
right?
Especially of a Christian inflection.
Right, and so when you consider the effects of the moral majority in how they discerned the movements of Carter's presidency and the eventual shift of the ebb and flow of the moral majority, one really sees that Carter's attempt at separating his personal integrity and faith from his exercise of the presidential office has left the kind of legacy where you look at him and you can't help but realize he has a tremendous amount of critics.
Right. He did then, and he I guess, after his presidency and his involvement with Habitat for Humanity and other humanitarian causes. I mean, my sense is, even personally, with my wife's and my discussion, she was much more of a Jimmy Carter fan than I was, and I always looked at him somewhat askance. It's hard to, it's impossible to deny the good work that he did, but I guess I sometimes wondered myself whether it was a kind of moral posturing, which, you know, I don't actually. There was, I think, in some of his utterances, whether a host of issues where he kind of came across as self-righteous.
We are continuing this conversation with D.G. Hart, professor of history at Hillsdale College. We're talking about the progressive evangelical perspective, if you will, of President Jimmy Carter and his own expression of faith. We are continuing this conversation on the other side of the break. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.
St. Andrew in Saline is a pre-K through 8th grade Catholic school offering a rigorous academic curriculum that focuses on spiritual growth in all things they do. Join them for their preschool and kindergarten open house to tour the school and meet the teachers. It will take place on Sunday, February 23rd from 1 to 3 p.m. To learn more, visit standrewsaline.org/school. Enrollment is open to everyone who's looking for a faith-based education.
Hi, I'm Ed Bahura. Are you kids struggling with school? Give them the boost they need with Sylvan Learning Centers. Our experienced tutors make learning fun and effective. And for a limited time, get the first month of tuition at 50% off. Call us now at 1-800-EDUCATE. Don't let this amazing offer pass you by. That's 50% off the first month at Sylvan Learning Centers, where brighter futures begin. Enroll today.
Do you own popular index mutual funds or ETFs? If so, you're automatically own shares of companies that conflict with your moral beliefs. Ave Maria mutual funds are managed to conform to pro-life and pro-family values. Long-term investors can invest in the no-load Ave Maria mutual funds. The experienced professional portfolio managers make decisions based on investment fundamentals and pro-life values. You can learn more about Ave Maria mutual funds today at 866-AVE-MARIA or visit AveMariaFunds.com.
Hi, Vanessa Denhagarmo here, inviting you to tune into Epiphany. We're made to praise God and celebrate our faith. I want to encourage listeners to connect, communicate, and collaborate with the faith community. Life is a journey, and along the way we have those epiphany moments that bring us closer to Christ. Please partner with me and celebrate the diversity of our Catholic Church.
Epiphany, weekdays at noon, only on Ave Maria Radio.
Teresa Tomeo spoke with the recently appointed Bishop Edward Weisenberger as the Archbishop of Detroit.
What's on your heart to share with the Catholics in the Archdiocese of Detroit right now, Your Excellency?
I think evangelization has got to be key to all of our efforts. To try to be Catholic without a community just doesn't work. I like to say Jesus called everyone into a personal relationship. He called no one into a private relationship.
Yeah.
But again, it means more than being a comfortable Catholic. It means being a committed Catholic, which sometimes means going outside of our comfort zones and really witnessing in unique ways.
Go to Ave Maria Radio's audio archive pages to hear Teresa Tomeo's entire February 12th interview with Bishop Edward Weisenberger at AveMariaRadio.net. And learn what's coming up daily on other Ave Maria Radio programs as we update you on Facebook and X.
Ave Maria in the Afternoon is underwritten by the following nonprofit organization: Real Estate for Life. Buying or selling your home or business property? Real Estate for Life can connect you with one of 1,400 pro-life real estate agents around the world. When Real Estate for Life receives a referral fee, they donate 70% to Ave Maria Radio and Human Life International. More information at realestateforlife.org or 877-LIFE-US1. That's realestateforlife.org.
St. Therese once told her sister Celine that when we trust ourselves and not God, our soul becomes barren and incapable of virtue. Her remedy? External works of charity. We all try to do it on our own sometimes without asking for God's help. At St. Paul Evangelization, we suggest sharing the gospel with someone who needs it. Check out streetevangelization.com to find a team near you where you can share the love of Jesus. If there isn't one in your area yet, perhaps God is calling you to start a team in your city. To learn more, visit streetevangelization.com.
Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. I'm talking with Darryl G. Hart, Professor of History at Hillsdale College, author of the most recently published book, American Catholic, The Politics of Faith During the Cold War. And we're talking about Jimmy Carter, lessons on politics, and how progressive evangelicals view him to this day, or even Christians in general in the United States view him to this day. And Darryl, we were talking earlier about, and I can respect your take on this, that there were certain occasions where some of Carter's statements could come across as moral grandstanding. If you recall the 1976 interview he did with Playboy magazine, that was a baffling event to say the least, but some of his statements in that interview scandalized the vast majority of conservative Christians in the U.S., if not in the world.
Right. He did talk about lust in his heart, and which, I mean, he was such a mild-mannered guy, as it were, and so conventional in his outward display and devoted to his wife. I mean, I personally, I was a young man at the time, but I think it kind of struck me as someone who was trying to be honest about how serious Christ's demands are about sinlessness or perfection, and the easy ways it would be to break the law. And you could also give him credit for saying something like that in a magazine that thrives on precisely lustful desires. Although whether he was smart about doing that, politicians go all sorts of places to get votes.
Yeah.
I have no idea what his campaign was up to. It's still a very curious piece of his career.
Yeah.
And it didn't cost him in the election necessarily, but it was a tight election with Ford in '76, and probably registered in a lot of people's minds that maybe they need to be more cautious about him.
Yeah. I remember. I say I remember. The truth is, I read about, and therefore I remember reading about. I wasn't alive in '76, but I should be careful. I think I show myself as I really show my age when I have these conversations. I'm not as old as I sound sometimes. But Jerry Falwell, the televangelist, the pastor, he made statements about Carter's statements to Playboy magazine that, for his listener base at the very least, which were your typical conservative evangelicals, they were, if they shared in his sentiment, then the disillusionment was shared on TV. Falwell's statement was effectively, 4 months ago the majority of the people I knew were pro-Carter, and today that has totally reversed. So I agree with you. I don't think that completely cost him the election, but it certainly became one of the many watershed moments wherein there was a certain shift away from evangelicals trusting Carter as a figure that they could depend on for Judeo-Christian morality in the political sphere.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's, again, we are a long way from that, and all sorts of norms have been violated since then by all sorts of presidents, not merely the man who's now in office, but even prior to that. And and in that I think that's part of the appeal of Carter, is that he does continues to represent a better time when politicians, public leaders were more circumspect and tried to be conform to certain moral expectations and norms in both public and private life, minus perhaps his admission to Playboy or his decision to give that interview.
Mm-hmm.
But the part of the reason why I wrote the piece the way I did was to see a number of historians come out who had their own political reasons for favoring Carter, but not necessarily always being clear about what those political reasons were, and therefore attributing to Carter the right kind of Christian conviction because he has the right kind of politics. And it wasn't necessarily clear to me which was leading which, whether it was the politics leading the faith or the faith leading the politics.
Right. Right. And like you said, that hallmark, that legacy of ambiguity is going to forever follow him. And because of that, his critics number in certain significance. 76, when he was elected, it was touted as being the year of the evangelical, but effectively as it progressed as a year in his presidential career, it was very clear he wasn't as conservative as most evangelicals at the time wanted him to be. And he did, however, show himself to be for the cause of many humanitarian issues, one of which was racial justice.
Right. Even though I really don't know the history of his administration well enough to understand what he might have done along those lines. Mm-hmm. Civil rights legislation is playing out and being administered in different federal agencies, and again, in hindsight, say now with Christopher Caldwell's great book Age of Entitlement about the way civil rights played out legally across a variety of institutions and sectors of American society. Then it was still a fresh thing, and President may not have always been as attentive to where this could go.
Yeah.
And we also are more aware, perhaps now, at least in the light of recent news, about how large these agencies are and how much conceivably can happen independent of a president's watch. Although, who among us could actually keep all of those balls in the air?
Oh, right. Yeah.
But no, that was much more the civil rights aspect of Carter's administration and governance was much more, I think, the way he understood his religion taking shape in public life.
Right. And so just to paint a more holistic picture, so yes, he's dealing with tremendous evangelical dissatisfaction from quite a number of people from the SBC as well, as you mentioned earlier. But we also post-Vietnam, post-Watergate, the interest rate in the economy at that point had risen, nearly 13%. Annual inflation was just over that. So he was factually juggling a lot of balls. And for a man who professes a simple, somewhat progressive evangelical faith, that's a lot to handle. And it's understandable how at any one juncture numerous people would be disappointed with him, because there's no pleasing everyone from the presidential office.
Right. But I think between his revelation that he was a born again Christian, and he was an active member of his home church. He taught Sunday school, although I got a little tired of hearing about that. And he was another politician for whom Reinhold Niebuhr was his favorite theologian. And I personally get a little tired of that. There are other theologians that people could read, but he was in some ways refreshing. He was a man of faith. He was a Southerner. He had been a governor of a southern state, obviously. I mean, he was coming along, I don't know, at a time that represented perhaps a way to heal certain divisions in America, both secular and religious, and even regional and racial. And in that sense, I think you could look at the Carter campaign as representing a hopeful side to America at a very difficult time in the nation's history.
Right. And one can't help but recall his crisis of confidence speech, the malaise speech, as we remember it. He never actually used that word, by the way. We just remember it as the malaise speech.
Yeah, and I think personally that there's probably too much optimism at times on the side of American presidents, and too much talk about how great we are, to the point where it becomes hollow. And so to give, I think people can plausibly give Carter a lot of credit for being realistic about certain difficulties facing the United States at that time. Particularly, I think what people associated with that speech was the idea that we all needed to wear sweaters, turn our heat down to save energy. And again, that the energy crisis then, and it's partly the beginnings of concerns about the environment, but climate, and looking for alternative sources of energy. But there was much more pessimism about what could be done to address the situation, rather than you sometimes also want a leader to talk about the possibilities, which resonates a lot with Americans who have a kind of can-do spirit.
Right.
And in that sense, Carter was out of step with that.
Yeah, which led Falwell and the moral majority to band with Reagan's brand of a kind of civil exercise of religion, and the American, like you mentioned, can-do spirit, and the American posture of protecting and advancing freedom and Republican democratic ideals throughout the world through military might. Darryl, thank you very, very much for having this conversation with us.
Sure. Glad to be with you. Thanks.
My guest, Professor D.G. Hart, he's a professor of history at Hillsdale College. We've been talking about the eclectic, I should say, presidential legacy of Jimmy Carter and his faith, and how he is still perceived by evangelicals, progressive and conservative alike. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, I'm Marcus Peter.